Hi, it's Geoff Chalmers here from discoverdouble-bass.com, which is the home of online learning for double bass players. We have a range of courses, lessons and interviews, discussions with world-renowned bass players, just like the one that I'm having today with one of my favourite players. This is somebody that I've known for quite some time who really doesn't need an introduction in the bass world, but I'll just let you know a little bit about him anyway. He's worked in all fields really of music, in the sense that he has been a principal bass player of Academy of St Martin in the Fields for over 20 years. He's worked as a soloist, as a teacher. He's currently teaching at Trinity, Laban in London, as well as masterclasses around the world, and he's a scholar of the double bass. He is hunting out, new music, old music, and trying to expand the horizons for, our beloved double bass. So let's welcome Leon Bosch. Leon, welcome.
Geoff, it's a real pleasure to be here. I mean, I've followed your web presence with amazement. It has grown incredibly over the last few years, and I'm very pleased to be here to be able to contribute to this.
Oh, it's really wonderful that you're here, Leon. I first met Leon probably nearly 15 years ago or something. I attended as a student a workshop, a week of double bass classes in the Lake District, and it was a really special week in my life. And all of the people who were on the course were really moved by the whole experience, and many have gone on to be professional players, and everybody has continued to push forward with the double bass.
And I think, thank you for reminding me about that. How many years ago was it?
It was something like, I think it was about 2008.
Yeah, so 12 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's extraordinary what can happen in 12 years. But at the time I came to do those masterclasses, I'd already developed what I thought was my system of teaching. And I think what you might have noticed at the time was that it wasn't just so much about music. It was about you as a human being, your attitude to the form of expression which we call music, and also the instrument. And since then I've developed this system of mine in a much more complicated way, in a more conscious way also. And I think it's foolproof. It works. Because everything that I expect anybody else to do, I will have struggled with myself. So I teach from the school of experience. Now, the term virtuosity is used very often, and people aspire to this ideal of virtuosity. But it's an important concept to have to examine. What does it mean? And also, does virtuosity apply only to instrumental technique, or does it also apply to something like teaching? Now, my view is that to become an instrumental virtuoso, you have to work really hard. It's not something that happens easily, because it's fine motor skills that have to be developed, also intellectually have to develop, and also spiritually, aesthetically. So how do you learn this concept of virtuosic teaching? It's through experience. What I first discovered when I started teaching, I started teaching as soon as I left music college. I became the double bass tutor for the Knowsley Youth Orchestra. And I could do anything that I wanted to do, and I found it easy. But I soon realized that other young people didn't find things as easy. And that I couldn't just tell them, this is how I do it. Just do it. I had to find a way to explain to them in very simple words what the challenge was, and to find a way and a language that spoke to everybody. Because as human beings, we learn in a very simple way, and it's easy to overcomplicate life. We learn through example. When a kid wants to learn to walk, it sees adults walking. Next thing, it pulls itself up in front of the sideboard, lets go, falls over. Tries again, stands a bit longer, falls over. And eventually takes one tentative step, and next thing you know, they're running. So what does that teach one? Consistent work, perseverance. You cannot achieve anything without real commitment. And the things that we take for granted, speech, walking, all the kind of normal activities, we only learn them well because we do them repeatedly, and we never give up till we've done it. It's easy to give up when something's too difficult to play. You say, oh, well, I can't play this piece, it's too difficult. But the truth is, if you break it down, and this is something called chunking, anything becomes possible. You break it down to small components and you put it back together, and hopefully, with a little bit of intellectual application and also spiritual intervention, you can make something beautiful. So I realized that teaching is also something which requires virtuosity. And how, with playing, you measure your virtuosity by the emotional impact upon your audience. Let's face it, we don't play music just in order to play all the right notes in the right order, in time and in tune. That's only the beginning. When we play a piece of music, we affect the emotions of all those in the room. There are these concentric circles of energy interacting. Sometimes the energy is at loggerheads, and that's when you find out that you cannot get on with certain people or certain audiences. An audience can be hostile. They don't have to say anything. You just feel it. You can feel it. Also, an audience can be on your side, and you know instantly when they are. So it's this kind of question of bringing together all those aspects of our humanity. How to make a piece of music meaningful, for example. What are the ingredients necessary? Eventually, I developed this algorithm for teaching, and I began to realize that it works incredibly well. Unless you know what it is you're really doing, you can end up spending lots of hours not achieving anything. So how to become very productive very quickly is to know what it is you're setting out to achieve. So my algorithm is very simple. It's 4 stages. The first stage deals with mechanical things. We take for granted this idea that you want to play a piece because you're motivated by the beauty of that piece and that you think you've got something special to say. Then you have to learn the mechanics of the piece, playing all the right notes in the right order in time and tune. Stage 1, that's continuity. And then once you've mastered that, and only once you've mastered that stage, then you go and do stage 2. Every note in front of you has further details. It has a dynamic. It's either loud or soft. And it also has an articulation. It's either long or short. So then you go through your piece, all the right notes in time and in tune, in the right order, with the correct dynamics and the correct articulation. And that's stage 2. You're only halfway. Then you get to stage 3. Every note has a purpose. It's either going somewhere or coming from somewhere. Phrasing. And then you have to play through the piece with that in mind in the stage 3. Also, stage 3 requires you to make all the academic analysis, all the intellectual analysis. Which key are you in? Every key has a character. If you're in C major, it's very different from playing in D major or in F sharp minor. Are you in the exposition? Are you in the development section? Are you in the recapitulation? Is it an elegy? Is it a tarantella? What is it? Because every piece of music has an intrinsic ingredient. You cannot play a scherzo in the same way that you would play an elegy. An elegy is a lament for the dead. A scherzo is supposed to be a bit of a joke.
Yeah.
So once you've mastered all these 3 aspects, the intellectual and the physical, you know about your dynamics and articulation, and you're absolutely clear that you've made a decision about what you want, then you return to the aesthetic thing. The difference between beauty and what's the opposite of beauty? Ugly. What makes something beautiful and what makes it ugly? How can you touch the emotion in everybody in your audience? What does the piece mean to you? So take the example of an elegy. Everybody knows the Botticini elegy.
Yes.
It is one of the most famous pieces written for double bass. But what is an elegy? It's a lament for the dead. So unless you start from that premise, you're not going to achieve anything particularly meaningful. Everybody has an experience of loss, of grief, and if you understand that that is what you're trying to express, the piece will become meaningful. I learned this question about the expression of grief very early on in life with the elegy. It was a feeling, it was a sensation. It wasn't just an intellectual approach. And I always knew when I had performed the piece well enough for it to have had an emotional impact, not just for me as an individual, but also for people in the room. And my first experience of that was with my second bass teacher, Max Runge. Max Runge is long dead, but his memory lives on. I have some of his music in my house, which he gave to me, and I'm sure he'd be delighted to know I use his music. But before an exam, I was going to play Botticini's Elegy and Tarantella. And we went into the concert hall where I was going to play with working lights only. And he sat in the corner, and I started playing. And when I got to the end of the elegy, I expected him to comment, but he remained silent. So I continued to the end of the Tarantella. And when I finished, he left the room. But as he left the room, I thought I saw something glint off his cheek. And I realized that he was crying. He didn't say a word and I didn't say a word, and he came back the next day and he said to me, "Leon, I'm sorry about yesterday. I had to leave because I was unable to speak. When you played the elegy, it reminded me of so many things that have happened to me in my life." And he and his family had escaped Nazi Germany. They were refugees from the terror. They lost many relatives, and also his wife had been a victim in a terrible accident a few years prior to that. And he told me that just hearing the elegy reminded him of all that heartache. And he said, "Congratulations on playing the piece so beautifully." And it made me realize something very fundamental about music that day. I was how old? 16 years old, 17 years old at the time. And that was a big change for me. Until then, I learned music because my parents believed it was a good thing to do. It was part of my general education, and learning to play an instrument well was something every kid around me wanted to do. They wanted to be able to play fast, but not necessarily slow. So virtuosity as an instrumentalist means being able to play fast and slow, but with immense expressivity, to be able to touch everybody in the room, and also to know that you're expressing something uniquely personal. And that, of course, is not self-centered, you understand, because we're all different. Our fingerprints, our irises are different. We share many things in common as human beings, but we're unique in our expression of our genes, and our personal experience changes us. So if you play Plaisir d'amour, it's about love. Love is a tender emotion, but the way in which you will play it will be different, because your experience of love is completely different to my experience of love. It's the same human sentiment, but entirely different. But I will recognize when you play Plaisir d'amour, because it will be tender and beautiful. So these are the things that bind us as human beings. So my purpose as a teacher is not necessarily to teach my students to be able to play the instrument mechanically, but it's to allow them to develop the tools to express themselves as human beings, to tell the world what they believe, to say something about the human experience. You must know that there's this wonderful video, The Great Violinists, with Yihle Moya and a dozen other great violinists, and they all play the opening of the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto. And it's almost like a different piece with every violinist. There was a time when it was not a problem to express one's humanity in such a unique manner. I'm worried that nowadays it would be possible to listen to a generation of violinists playing Mendelssohn, and you'd have to wait till the end of the performance to really know who it was when you hear the announcement. So my role as a pedagogue, as a teacher, is to allow every student of mine that freedom of expression, and also to help them to develop as human beings, spiritually, intellectually, and in every other way. To be a great musician, you don't only have to be able to play the instrument, you have to be well nourished in so many parts of the human spirit. You have to feel intellectually alive, and you have to feel spiritually well. My first teacher, Zoltan, always used to ask me a question when I walked through the door: "Have you practiced?" And I soon learned that I had to be really honest, because I could get thrown out otherwise. But I generally tend to ask my students a simple question: "So how are you feeling?" And when I say how are you feeling, I mean in three spheres: physically, intellectually, and emotionally. And if they mark themselves lower than 5 out of 10 for each of those, there's a problem. Because every day we get up, we have to feel $1 million. We have to feel like tackling the world and getting on with that thing which is your mission in life. Music, to me, is not just a question of earning a living or doing something for status or anything else. It's a way of life. It became resistance to me early on in my life, and then a means of expression. There's not a day that has passed that I haven't played the bass since I started learning it. Not a day has passed when I haven't been working on a new piece. And I try to encourage in my students this same, dare I use the word fervor?
Are you excited to see them make their journey and move forward? It's such a personal connection with somebody, because your students are coming to you that already have the facility. You know, they're not coming to you to learn.
True. You have a responsibility for their lives. It is a huge responsibility to affect the future of everybody that comes through your door. You have to be well prepared. You also have to understand them as human beings, not just as the instrumentalist that walks, as you say. Often people will come technically quite well advanced. But you might find that the technique that they developed is not suitable for the human expression, so you have to make amendments to their technical facility or their intellectual understanding. Also, what I find with a lot of students is that they might be technically adept and intellectually adept, but no real sense of mission, perhaps, or the freedom to know that they should pursue something which defines them. What is it that's going to make you, the human being, different from the other 950 million bass players, or however many there are in the world nowadays? There's so many bass players, many more than at any time in history. And I have some troubling questions as I see the double bass world. I was very lucky that in my life I had many people who trusted me as a musician, even as a young instrumentalist. I mean, the first time I was given something of real importance to do was at the age of 17. I had to deputize for my teacher, Zoltan Kovacs, with professional musicians in a performance of the Trout Quintet. He trusted me to do it, and I had to deliver. It wasn't even a question of would I do it. I knew I had to. I couldn't let him down. And I always had the sense of responsibility. But I think to myself today, I was 17 when I performed that function for him, so how many years later? Many decades later. If I were to withdraw tonight, let's say, from a live broadcast of a performance of the Trout Quintet, are there any young musicians up to the age of 30, let's be generous, let's not call it 17, but up to the age of 30, that I would trust to walk into a broadcasting studio, live on radio, to deputize for me? And I have trouble thinking about this. I'm sure that there are players who could play all the notes. But would there be musicians who would be able to hold their own musically, intellectually, and in every other way in a room full of grand artists, and also with a microphone in front of them? So I think what that probably tells us is that there might be a problem in teaching. There might also be a problem in opportunity, and also in aspirations. And you asked previously the question, what makes a good student? Sometimes I have the feeling that students choose the place to study based upon the importance of the institution, the historical importance, and also their importance in a perceived pecking order. But what I've come to realize was that often students who go into these great institutions sink rather than swim or prosper. And there's a very good reason for this. Just think, the principal conductor, music director of the Berlin Philharmonic, Kirill Petrenko, where did he study? He didn't study at a famous conservatoire. He studied a little conservatoire in Austria, in Vorarlberg. But what made the difference, I think, for him was that he had the opportunity every day to see his professor, if he chose. He had peace and quiet. He could work at his own rate, discover what he needed to discover, and have the help from everybody around him. He wasn't just a number. He was one of their students. They believed in him. They gave
community.
It was a community. They gave him everything he needed. He had the opportunity to experiment with music and to learn. And of course, today he's a great musician. He's a great conductor. And it wasn't that long ago that the BBC proms had no idea who he was. And they wouldn't engage him to do the proms. They said that nobody ever heard of this guy. And then he became principal conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic. So you have to choose your institution carefully as a student. You have to know what it is you need to learn, what you wish to learn, and who can teach you that. One could use kind of easy metaphors. For example, would you learn to ride a bicycle from somebody who will sit in an armchair and tell you how to ride it, or would you learn from somebody who has a track record riding a bicycle? It's the experience that matters. I mean, the violinist Alan Loveday, who made the Seasons famous, when he talked about teaching and what made him different to many other teachers was, he said, look, many colleagues pontificate from the safety of an armchair. He said, but I could demonstrate. And actually, that's so powerful. If you're going to teach somebody to play a piece, you at least have to have performed it in public yourself. You must know that we learn most brutally in public. That's when we find out when we really know
There's
something.
a different threshold, isn't there, from the practice
Exactly.
room to the stage?
Playing something in one's living room is relatively straightforward, but as soon as you put one person in the room, it changes. Then you put a dozen in the room, and then you put a few hundred.
But how can students get, I guess, how can they get that then? How can they move forward with that?
This is part of this problem which I allude to. How do you get all these experiences necessary? How do you put in the time, the apprenticeship? Look, in the session business, for example, I do a lot of session work, as you know. I've played hundreds of films and thousands of pop tracks. But in the good old days, to get into the studios, you already will have had a track record as a musician. You would have, for the violinist, they'd have led an orchestra or played in a string quartet or be a soloist but they would have a track record. And that was, getting to the studios was the reward for having a great track record as a musician. Nowadays, there's the ambition to be a session musician, for no other reason, I think, than that it pays slightly better than playing concerts, or not slightly better, a lot better than playing concerts. But one needs to do one's apprenticeship, so to speak. So the young musicians have to learn many things. Bass players, how are you going to earn a living as a double bass player? The last person to make a living purely from playing the double bass as a solo instrument was Gary Carr, or is Gary Carr. I would have loved to have done the same thing, to do nothing other than play solo double bass, because that is the thing that motivated me beyond everything else in life. But I had to be practical. I realized that I left music college, I got married, I suddenly had a family, I had responsibilities. And at that point I realized that actually my education had been very useful, because I could audition for symphony orchestras to get a job. I also could play in chamber orchestra, I could play chamber ensemble, I could play string ensemble, I could do everything that a good musician is supposed to do. Also, I had the opportunity. By the time I went to university, I'd already learned the string ensemble repertoire. I knew the Vivaldi concertos, I knew the Holberg suite, Tchaikovsky serenade, Dvorak, all the major serenades. I'd played them not just once, but many times. And I'd been drilled by the man called Noel Travers, who ran this ensemble in South Africa, way ahead of its time. But so by the time I came to university and music college, I already knew that repertoire. At university, I learned the chamber orchestra repertoire in Cape Town. I played the Haydn symphonies. I played all the solos, 6, 7, and 8, the horn signal, in 4 years. And then I went to the Royal Northern College of Music as a postgrad student, and I also had the experience of playing all the symphony orchestra repertoire. But as you probably know, whilst I was a student in Cape Town, I played as an extra player in the Cape Town Symphony Orchestra. I played with great conductors as a kid. I used to sit next to my teacher Zoltan at the front desk for the rehearsals, and he would keep a very keen eye on what I was doing. And for the concert, I sat at the back on the fourth desk. But I very quickly learned an enormous amount of music. Chamber music, as I said, I started my first meaningful trout when I was 17. And by the time I left music college in Manchester, I'd played all the major repertoire, chamber music repertoire with double bass in concert. Most days of my student career in Manchester, we performed. There was a hunger to perform. There was a young bassoon player at the time called Andrew Bassi. And every night he would gather musicians, he would conduct, and anybody who wanted to play a concerto could stand up in front of the orchestra and play. If we wanted to play the Francais, whichever Sporn on it, we got together the musicians, and we soon formed a regular ensemble. And by the time I left the Royal Northern, I'd played all the chamber music possible. And now when I return to it, it is like an old friend. And I think this is the kind of education that young people miss a little bit today. To return briefly to this question of virtuosity in teaching, Trinity Laban Conservatoire is, in my view, a unique kind of conservatoire. It has an ethos which is very different from all other major music colleges that I've encountered. Anything is possible. And for example, when we audition people or prospective students, it is not just a question of how well they play in the audition. How does one identify and evaluate potential? And I would like to think that I've learned this question of identifying potential because of my own experience. When I auditioned for music college, I wouldn't say that I was the greatest musician or instrumentalist at the time, but somebody spotted something in me and gave me the chance. And I realize now how to identify that thing. So just to give you a little small example of this possibility for seeing potential and developing it properly. One of my students, just in the last few days, sent me a message from India, where he is in lockdown like the rest of us.
Wow.
Just to let you know that I received my final results. He is now a Master of Music, M.Mus. But do you know that he's achieved this M.Mus in the space of 5 years? When he started with me, he could not play the bass. He couldn't hold it properly. He couldn't hold the bow.
That's incredible.
He came to Conservatoire, technically, should I say deficient or what, without the foundation.
Without skills.
Nothing whatsoever. Within 1 year, he looked like a bass player. Within 2 years, he sounded like a bass player. In 3 years, he sounded incredible. Anybody who ever heard him said, my God, how's this possible? By the time he did his 4th year, he played, for example, in his 4th year exam, the British premiere of a sonata for double bass by Dmitri Smirnov, the Russian composer. Now, as you know, Dmitri sadly died of COVID recently. But this sonata, one movement sonata, is one of the most beautiful pieces of music written. And part of the reason I got Just Hill to learn it was that so I could learn it also. I learned it, and in effect we learned it together. We found good solutions. And Just Hill performed it with incredible distinction. And then, of course, now he's Master of Music. And just think, it is possible that if Just Hill had auditioned anywhere else, he would not be a musician today. So it's important that we don't just look at things as we find them, but we also see what is possible in the future. And I mean this not just for music, but for everything that we encounter. The future is ours to create.
Well, that's a wonderful note to finish there. I think this idea of anything is possible, and hearing your story and the way that you've fostered all of this wonderful talent in the double bass world. So thank you on behalf of everybody that studied with you. I've been a student of yours, and you've affected a lot of people in this world, Leon. So thank you. Yeah, please let us know about how people can find out more about you. Where can people find you online, Leon?
LeonBosch.com. I have a publishing company, imusicantepublishing.com. I have an ensemble, imusicante.co.uk. But basically, just put my name into search engine and you'll find out everything about me. About what I'm up to, what I've done, what I haven't done, what I should be doing, and what I still would like to do.
Well, that's wonderful, Leon. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you for watching at home. I hope that you've enjoyed this conversation. Keep practicing hard, whatever you're doing. Remember, anything's possible, and we'll see you next time.